Rendering motion blur directly in Blender can take a lot of time. That's why in today's tutorial I want to show you how to add motion blur in Compositing, both in Blender's own Compositor and in Fusion within DaVinci Resolve. This can improve render times and gives you the possibility to adjust the strength of the motion blur even after rendering. So let me show you. Alright, so this right here is the animation that I'm going to use in this tutorial in order to demonstrate how this works. So let's render this out, but before we do so, make sure that you go to the view layer properties and enable the vector render pass. And as you can see right now, this is grayed out, so we first need to go to the render properties and disable motion blur. I'm also using cycles, and when we now go back to the view layer properties, you can see that vector isn't grayed out anymore and we can enable it. With this set up, let's also go to the output properties, and here make sure that you use the OpenEXR multi-layer format. With all of this set up, let's just render it out as an animation. Alright, so now that we have this rendered out as an EXR sequence, let's open it up in Blender and let me show you how to add motion blur in the Compositor. So first of all, I want to make a few adjustments on the workspace, so I don't like to use the dope sheet. Instead, let's open up this timeline down here, then enable use nodes, and I don't like to use the backdrop, so I'm just going to disable it and instead open up a new window and switch this to the image editor. Right here, load in our viewer node, and then in the Compositor itself, also bring in a viewer node, and whatever we now plug in here will be visible in the viewer. We don't need to render layers, so let's delete it and instead bring in an image input. Let's connect this to the composite output, which is what we're going to render out, and the viewer, which we can preview in this image editor. Then let's open up our EXR sequence, so press A to select all the frames and open image to load in our image sequence. Now I think we need to connect this again, so plug the combined into the composite and the viewer output. Now you can already see this in our preview window. Down here you can see that we have 549 frames, so let's also set the timeline accordingly, 549. And we also need to set the resolution, so let's go to the output settings and set it to 2160 by 3840. Okay, so now you might have already seen that we have this vector output right here that we can use to add the motion blur. So let's press Shift A and bring in a vector blur node. Then again plug this into both outputs. If we use it just like this, nothing happens, but once we plug the vector into the speed, you can see that we get some motion blur. So let's maybe go to a frame with a bit more movement. So this right here is with motion blur and this is without. So we get a clear difference. And we can also play around with this blur value. So currently this is set to 0.25, but if I bring this up to 1, for example, we get a bit more extreme motion blur. I think this is too much, so I'm just going to set this to 0.5, which I think is fine in this case. So once more, let's take a look at another frame. And again, we can clearly see the difference with motion blur and without. Alright, so next let me show you how to do the same thing in Fusion in DaVinci Resolve. So I open up a new project, let's switch to the Fusion workspace, and right here with Control and Space I'm gonna add in a loader node. This allows us to load in the EXR sequence, and when you now take a look at this, you can see that the colors are completely off. So let's fix this by bringing in a gamut node. Bring this in here, and for the output space, simply switch this to sRGB, and now the colors look correct. Next, we need to bring in the vector pass, so let's copy and duplicate our loader node, and in here, go to the format options, go to the channels, and switch red, green, and blue to view layer vector X, Y, and Z. And I'm just going to disable the alpha, so set it to none. And when you now take a look at this, you can see this is what our vector pass looks like. Now in order to use this, we need to bring in a vector blur node. So in Fusion, this is called vector motion blur. Let's add this in. And now we simply need to plug our vector pass into this green input. We still don't get any motion blur, but if you select the vector blur node and go in here, we can change the X channel to red and the Y channel to green. And now you can see that we get proper motion blur. So this is without and this is with motion blur. So let's increase the length of our clip a bit so that we can see the rest of the frames as well. So now let's go to the end of our animation. And as you can see, we now get nice motion blur. And in here as well, we can always scale the motion blur. So if you want more, you can bring this value up, or you can bring it down if you want less motion blur. So in this case, again, I think I'm gonna set it to something around 0.5. That's it for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you could learn something new, and if you have any further questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Bye!